podcast to help you find peace with food and overcome disordered eating. And I'm Harriet Frew, aka the Eating Disorder Therapist. And I'm so excited to share with you all kinds of stories, tips, information, and guest interviews to help you on your journey in finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. Now, today is a bite-sized episode, and I want to talk all about the Minnesota Starvation Study. Now, if you listen to this podcast, you probably heard me mention the Minnesota Starvation Study on many a podcast, but I don't believe I've ever actually sort of done more of a deep dive and really gone into it. And I thought it would be a very valuable thing for you to listen to, actually, because of it's incredibly validating if you have an eating disorder to hear about this starvation study and what happened to the people when they were starved of food. Because I think so often when you have an eating disorder, you start to think there is something wrong with me, I have no control around food, I'm damaged, I'm flawed, I'm just this crazy person, other people aren't like me around food. And the Minnesota Starvation Study is something that can be incredibly validating and helps everyone understand so much better just what happens when a human being is starved. And it is really quite devastating psychologically and physically. So let's dive in. So what is the Minnesota Starvation Study? So America joined World War II in 1941. So by this time, Europe was already experiencing rationing and food shortages. So Ancel Keys was an American doctor, and he really saw the value in understanding what would happen if we really had these world shortages and they led to starvation, and if many people were going to be short of food and what was going to happen. So he thought, okay, we need to look at this, we need to do a study to really explore the impact of starvation on human beings. Now, of course, this experiment would not be ethical today, thankfully. However, we are very thankful to Ancel Keys that this experiment went ahead, because it really provides us with some great information, and it's one of these scientific experiments that is referred back to again and again. And interestingly, when I was doing some research for this episode, apparently the men who took part in the study all said that they would do it all over again if they had the chance. So I don't know where that came from or how true that is, but there you go. It was obviously a life experience for everyone. So Ancel Keys set about with one of the most ambitious health experiments ever undertaken, so to provide the definitive study of hunger and refeeding. So Keys achieved this goal, and also unintentionally he's provided us with one of the most crucial insights into dieting and weight loss to this day. So the Minnesota Starvation Experiment started with an advert posted across America in May 1944. And the advert said, "Will you starve that they be better fed?" Now, depending on where you read up about this, 200 to 400 conscientious objectors volunteered as an alternative to war. So, these men that didn't want to fight, they decided to take part in the study, to try and help out their country, I guess. And Keys and his team of researchers kind of whittled down those, whatever it was, 200 to 400 applicants, just to 36 men. And they were chosen for their kind of physical and emotional sort of robustness. They kind of really took people on board for the study who they felt were kind of like coping, managing well, generally in life, good health, etc. The men were all aged between 20 and 33. And if you really want to read this study in great detail, it's all published in the Biology of Human Starvation from 1950. So do go and check it out if you love research and you want to really dive deep into it all. So the year-long experiment was split into 4 phases. So there was initially a control period of 12 weeks. So the key goal of this period was to find out the calorie requirement for the men, and it was established that the men maintained their weight at approximately 3,210 calories a day, whilst walking 22 miles each week, an average of just 3 miles a day, 45 to 60 minutes of walking. There was then a starvation period of 24 weeks. So it's very interesting because this was described as a starvation period, and the calories were restricted for the men to approximately 1,600 calories per day. Now, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think in our culture today, people follow many more extreme diets than 1,600 calories a day. When it's still low, it's still not enough, but it's not kind of on the level that some people will follow today. So I think that's just an interesting point to note. Obviously, as well, these men were very active as well, and when their sort of natural requirements were over 3,000 calories a day, you can see how 1,600 would have actually been definitely putting them in a very restricted place. And the meals were made up of foods typically available in Europe during the latter stages of the war, so potatoes, turnips, bread and macaroni. And Ansel Keys set out to try and induce a 25% weight loss in each man in 24 weeks. So that's quite substantial. So there was then a restricted rehabilitation period. So the men were given sort of like controlled amounts of food in that rehabilitation period. And then there was later an unrestricted rehabilitation period where the men could kind of eat freely without any restrictions. So what is fascinating about this study is that the results gathered were shocking, and I think far more shocking than Ansel Keys ever anticipated. So physically, the men reported hunger, weakness, exhaustion, and they lost 21% of their strength in the first 12 weeks alone. They experienced dizziness, muscle wasting, hair loss, and reduced coordination. And several withdrew from their university classes because they didn't have the energy or motivation to attend. And these were men who were previously outgoing and driven, but they quickly became sluggish and unmotivated, and also they became constantly irritated by each other's mere existence. And I know just from talking to my clients sometimes, when they're in that restrictive starvation stage, just every little thing in life becomes such an irritation. We become so sensitive to everything when we are starved. But most noticeably, the psychological impact was overwhelming. So the participants developed a fascination with food, and they were suddenly not interested in any other topic. And a number actually even became chefs after the experiment because their interest was so piqued. They began collecting recipes and cookbooks and started strange rituals while eating, such as cutting up their food into very small pieces and taking hours and hours to eat their meals. So they had to buddy up to avoid breaking their diets, as their drive to binge was so enormous. Now, isn't that so interesting? Because I think people often think there's something wrong with me that I want to binge, feeling this out of controlness. Before the buddy system was in place, a couple of the men did get hold of some forbidden food and binged, and they suffered extreme guilt and self-loathing as a result. So it's fair to assume really that if the men hadn't had those confinements around them and having to diet, they would have lost control around their eating way sooner. The men reported extreme depression, irritability, a sense of deprivation, and they lost all interest in sex. And they actually lost all interest in anything other than food. Such is the human drive to overcome hunger. So what's so interesting as well is one participant said, food became the one central and only one thing in my life. I mean, if I went to a movie, I wasn't particularly interested in the love scenes, but I noticed every time they ate and what they ate. Isn't that so fascinating? And some subjects also became captivated by the mere sight of others eating. And one of the 36 participants who took his girlfriend to a fancy restaurant just to enjoy seeing her eat. And some participants went as far as to steal food-related items, things like coffee cups, to satisfy their intense cravings. Together with their calorie intake, calorie intake declining, the mental health of the participants also rapidly declined. The experiments reported significant increases in hysteria, hypochondriac symptoms, and low mood. And 4 participants were not included in the final report for breaking their diet, 2 of which ended up being in hospital due to psychotic symptoms that were mostly resolved once they resumed to eating normally. So I hope that as you're listening, some of this research information can be quite validating to you. Because I know if you suffer from an eating disorder, and maybe if you've been suffering a while, often your symptoms become your new normal. And you have forgotten what it's like not to be so preoccupied with food. Food has become your life. It's very difficult maybe to remember how things were before. But I think what's just illuminating from this study is just the impact, the devastating impact of starvation on the human body, to us physically and mentally. And I'm going to go to talk now a bit about what happened in the rehabilitation period, and also to give you some hope and insight into what can happen actually when you start to eat more normally again and to weight restore, and the impact on some of the symptoms. So for the men, firstly, they had a restricted rehabilitation period, and 4 different groups of men were given 400, 800, 1200 or 1600 additional calories per day. And some of each group as well were given additional vitamin and protein supplements. But what Ansel Keys found was that the only thing that determined the speed at which the men recovered was actually the calorie intake. So the body didn't really respond to having extra vitamins or protein. It just wanted the energy, that calorie deficit, to be reversed, because the body just wanted to survive. As human beings, we're designed for survival over anything else. And I think, again, this is quite validating, because I think often in recovery, you can think about wanting to recover using the perfect meal plan, the perfect proportions of different foods. And it's just realizing, in a way, your body just wants the food. It just wants the calories in. And that is going to be the most quickest and the most effective way to get you to your goal. So during the refeeding phase for the men, the dizziness and the sluggishness were quick to subside, but the more complex psychological symptoms persisted. And many participants reported severe binge eating. The men overate and binged to correct the calorie deficit they had suffered. And men who had previously shown no awareness of body size and image reported feeling fat. I think this is fascinating as well, because this is, again, back in the days, way before social media and all the influences that we have today. So there's definitely something that happens to the human brain when we are starved of food that makes us more focused on body image as well. So it's really helpful to realise that extra preoccupation around body image is also really exacerbated by a starved brain. So the men also reported a decreased ability to understand hunger signals for many months, and some stated that it took up to 2 years before they felt normal again. And interestingly, the scores indicating recovery from depression correlated with calories received during the rehabilitation phase. So it sounds like actually, that the low mood that people experienced when they were starved was corrected in many ways by just having more calories, just by not being starved anymore. And I guess, like with eating disorders as well, it can be more complex than that. I don't want to kind of give out a message that just eating more calories is going to solve all your mental health struggles. But I think it's just really important to acknowledge, in a way, that a starved brain is not really a happy brain, not really a happy person. And I think the thing about hunger signals taking a couple of years to restore again, I just think about my own recovery after being starved. It definitely did take time for me to be able in touch with my hunger and fullness, and to feel much more peaceful around food. But that did happen. It just did take a bit of time. And I think it's quite tricky just to sort of cross directly back across the river almost. Like, once you've dieted, you have disrupted your relationship with food. So you can't just cross the bridge back across the river to how you may have been sort of pre-dieting. It does take a bit of time, but it is really, really possible. Okay, time for a short advertisement break. So I know we talk a lot about food freedom on this podcast, and how important it is to take care of yourself mentally and physically as you learn to navigate a culture inundated with toxic messaging. So one of the best ways to take care of yourself is through exercise, but I know it can be really hard to find an exercise program that isn't rooted in these toxic messages and doesn't feel triggering. Well, recently I met Katie, the owner of an amazing new exercise company called WeShape. And WeShape doesn't focus on calorie counting, tracking how much you work out, or making you feel bad about your body to get you motivated. Instead, they create a customized exercise program for you that helps you connect with and care for your body rather than feeling pressure to change it. They help you to learn to set intentions that come from a place of self-care rather than self-judgment, and they support you with every step of the way with an amazing community and live coaching so you can make exercise a self-care practice that helps you feel better in your body and about your body. Plus, they're giving listeners of the show the chance to try it out for 2 full weeks for free. Just head on over to www.weshape.com/freedom or check out the link in the show notes to get started today. So the body will do whatever it takes to reverse the effects of starvation and dieting. So the Minnesota Starvation Study finished a few months after the war had ended, but the team of experimenters were still able to provide guidance for the rehabilitation of those who were starved during the war like they had originally intended. So what's really interesting as well is their main advice for the refeeding of the men was that their caloric intake needed to be very high. Now, they were saying approximately 4,000 calories a day for the first months of refeeding, and this was really important, more important even than the nutritional value of the foods given. So I think when you're in recovery from anorexia nervosa, sometimes you need to eat so much and it can feel like it's binging, it can feel like really overwhelming and out of control and like too much food, but your body does need it, okay? Your body does need a lot of calories in that weight restoration phase. And that's not the only legacy left by the study, because the results are still used today in the concept of eating disorders. We use it very much in eating disorder therapy as a psychoeducation tool to help people understand about the impact of starvation on the body. The profiles of the men during semi-starvation of the 32 men who completed the study have been described as well as extremely similar to that of patients with anorexia nervosa. Furthermore, the profile of the men who broke their diet and were removed from the study greatly resemble those of bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder patients. So, firstly, the experiment showed that the characteristics that were originally believed to result due to a predisposition to such disorders, namely depression or impulsivity, were in fact a byproduct of starvation. Okay, the power of starvation is huge. So, it's so helpful. Today, for these reasons, clinicians have found it extremely beneficial to tell their patients about the results of the study, because it really helps, if you're recovering from an eating disorder, it helps you understand the extent of what you're doing to your body and the mental and physical impact of depriving yourself. And this isn't to give you a stick to beat yourself with, it's trying to offer you a way to have more understanding and insight, and to also offer yourself compassion. For any human being starved of food, they're going to be experiencing so many of the symptoms that you are experiencing too. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that and found it a helpful insight. There are lots of summary articles of the Minnesota Starvation Study online, so do go and have a Google if you're interested to find out more. And also, if you really want to do a deep dive, do go to the Biology of Human Starvation 1950 and have a deep dive into it. I think it's like over 1,000 pages. I don't know if I just made that up, but I'm sure I've just read that somewhere. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out, the Eating Disorder Therapist _. You might want to join our Eating Disorders Prevention event online, Saturday the 30th of September. Link is in the show notes for that, bringing together lots of professionals, a day to really be uplifted, inspired around prevention on all things eating disorders and body image. You might also want to join my bite-sized eating disorder therapy, only £5 a month. Try it for a week for free and a chance to get extra episodes, video content, skills and tips from the therapy room, etc. And if you enjoyed this podcast, I'd be so grateful if you would follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.